Picture this. It's 1987 in Riverside, California. The temperature's pushing 95 degrees at the local quarter-mile strip. A line of heavily modified muscle cars sits rumbling in the staging lanes, supercharged big blocks, nitrous-fed small blocks, thousands of dollars in chrome and billet aluminum gleaming under the desert sun. And then there's this kid, 17 years old, grease under his fingernails, rolling up in a primer gray 73 Nova that sounds like it's running on 7 cylinders. The other racers are laughing. The track announcer can barely hide his amusement. This teenager just lined up against a $30,000 Pro Street Camaro with a car that looks like it was assembled from swap meet leftovers. And 43 seconds later, that same teenager is collecting his winner's trophy while the Camaro owner is on his hands and knees staring at a puddle of coolant spreading across the asphalt. The Nova? Still idling smooth as butter. Temperature gauge sitting steady at 180 degrees. The secret wasn't some exotic racing part or revolutionary technology. It was a $40 junkyard modification and an understanding of physics that most hot rodders completely overlooked. This is the story of Danny Chen, the Riverside teenager, who proved that in the world of grassroots drag racing, brains beat budgets every single time. To understand why Danny's approach was so revolutionary, we need to travel back to the mid-1980s hot rod scene. This was the golden age of aftermarket performance parts. Every magazine was packed with ads for tunnel ram intakes, lumpy camshafts, and headers that promised 50 horsepower gains. The prevailing wisdom was simple: more compression, more carburetor, more cam, more power. Period. If your engine wasn't making at least 400 horsepower, you weren't even trying. The problem? Most of these backyard builders were creating time bombs. Riverside Raceway wasn't Pomona. This wasn't some NHRA-sanctioned event with perfect track prep and ideal conditions. This was grassroots racing at its grittiest. The track surface was inconsistent. The staging lanes were in direct sunlight. You might wait 45 minutes between rounds while sitting in 95-degree heat. By the time you got to the finals, half the field had already broken something or overheated. The guys with the biggest engines and the wildest modifications, they usually went home on a trailer. Danny Chen saw this pattern every single weekend. While working at his uncle's auto repair shop after school, he'd watch customer after customer come in with blown head gaskets, melted pistons, and scattered connecting rods. These weren't mechanical failures, they were engineering failures. Guys were building engines for magazine dyno pulls, not for surviving 8 runs in desert heat. They were chasing peak numbers instead of consistency. They were solving the wrong problem. Danny's approach started with a fundamental question that nobody else was asking. What if the goal wasn't to make the most power, but to make usable power that lasted? What if instead of building an engine that made 450 horsepower for 30 seconds before grenading, you built one that made 300 horsepower all day long? The foundation of Danny's build was a 350 cubic inch Chevy small block, not a 383 stroker, not a 406. Just a boring stock displacement 350 that he pulled from a wrecked '79 pickup truck for $200. The block had 127,000 miles on it. The cylinder walls still showed the factory crosshatch pattern. Most guys would have immediately bored it 30 over, installed forged pistons, and started chasing compression. Danny did none of that. He ran a ball hone through the cylinders, installed new rings on the stock pistons, and called it good. Total investment so far, $237 including gaskets. Here's where Danny's engineering insight came into play. While everyone else was focused on peak horsepower, Danny was obsessed with volumetric efficiency and heat management. He understood something that most hot rodders missed. An engine is basically an air pump. The more efficiently you can move air through it, the more power you'll make. But here's the critical part. That efficiency drops dramatically as intake air temperature rises. For every 10-degree increase in intake temperature, you lose approximately 1% of your power. In Riverside's conditions, with underhood temperatures reaching 200 degrees, engines were giving up 30-40 horsepower just from heat soak. Danny's first modification addressed this directly. Instead of buying a fancy aluminum intake manifold for $400, he kept the stock cast iron piece. Cast iron has 3 times the thermal mass of aluminum. It takes longer to heat up and acts as a heat sink. While the aluminum intakes on other cars were heat-soaking after 2 runs, Danny's iron intake was still relatively cool after 5. But that was just the beginning. The game-changing modification came from the most unlikely source imaginable, a 1974 Cadillac Eldorado in a pick-and-pull junkyard. Danny wasn't there for the Cadillac. He was looking for vacuum lines when he noticed something peculiar about the Eldorado's air cleaner assembly. It had this strange thermal vacuum switch connected to a flapper door that controlled where the engine got its air from. When cold, it pulled warm air from around the exhaust manifold. When hot, it switched to cooler outside air. GM called it the Thermax system. Most people ripped them off immediately because they were ugly and complicated. Danny saw opportunity. He paid $12 for the entire air cleaner assembly, including the thermal switch and vacuum motor. Back in his garage, he spent 3 days modifying it to work with his Nova. But here's where Danny's genius really showed. Instead of using it the way GM intended, for emissions and cold start performance, he reversed the logic. He modified the thermal switch to activate at 180 degrees and rigged it to a second snorkel he fabricated from dryer vent tubing. This snorkel ran to the front of the car behind the grille where it could grab cold air from outside the engine bay. The beauty of this system was its simplicity. During staging and initial launch, when underhood temps were manageable, the engine breathed normally through the standard air cleaner. But by the time he hit second gear, when underhood temperatures were climbing rapidly, the thermal switch would activate. The vacuum motor would close the hot air door and open the cold air passage. Suddenly, instead of breathing 200-degree air from under the hood, the engine was getting 95-degree ambient air from outside. That's a 105-degree difference. Using the 1% per 10 degrees rule, Danny was preserving about 10% of his power just from this one modification. But Danny wasn't done. He understood that cooler air is also denser air. Denser air means more oxygen molecules per cubic foot. More oxygen means you can burn more fuel. More fuel burned efficiently means more power. At 95 degrees, air is about 8% denser than at 200 degrees. Combined with the reduced detonation tendency of cooler air, Danny could run more aggressive timing without knock. Where other guys were pulling timing to prevent detonation in the heat, Danny was adding it. The next piece of the puzzle was the carburetor. Everyone was running Holley double pumpers, 750s, 850s, some guys even running 1050 Dominators on 350s because bigger had to be better, right? Danny went the opposite direction. He found a 600 CFM vacuum secondary Holley at a swap meet for $80. It was considered too small for a performance 350. The previous owner had upgraded to a 750 and was happy to unload it. Danny rebuilt it with a $28 kit and spent 3 weekends at the track with a box of jets, a vacuum gauge, and a notebook. Here's what most people didn't understand about carburetor sizing. A 350 cubic inch engine spinning at 6,000 RPM only needs about 610 CFM of airflow at 100% volumetric efficiency. Street engines rarely exceed 85% VE, which means that 350 actually needs about 520 CFM. The 600 was perfect. The smaller carburetor meant higher air velocity through the ventures, which meant better fuel atomization, which meant more complete combustion. While the guys with 850s were loading up and fouling plugs in the staging lanes, Danny's engine was running clean and crisp. And in the tuning process was methodical. Danny would make 1 jet change, make 3 runs, record the times and temperatures, Then make another change. He mapped out the entire fuel curve, finding that the engine ran best at 12:8.1 air-fuel ratio at wide-open throttle, slightly leaner than the 12:5.1 most people targeted. That extra bit of leanness meant slightly cooler combustion temperatures and less likelihood of detonation. He could run 36 degrees of total timing when everyone else was limited to 32 grains. The ignition system was another exercise in simplicity over technology. While other racers were installing MSD boxes, high-output coils, and rev limiters, Danny stuck with the stock HEI distributor from the pickup truck. He did three things: replaced the module with a good GM unit, installed a performance coil, and recurved the advance weights using the springs from a Mr. Gasket kit that cost $7. The total advance came in at 2,800 RPM, perfect for launching on street tires without bog or wheel spin. Now, let's talk about the camshaft, because this is where Danny really diverged from conventional wisdom. The hot setup in 1987 was to run the biggest, lumpiest cam you could find. Guys were running 290-degree duration cams with 550 aids lift in street cars. They sounded mean as hell, but made no power below 3,500 RPM and were terrible for heat dissipation because of the reduced overlap and pumping efficiency. Danny chose a mild hydraulic cam with 268 degrees of advertised duration and 0.465s lift. It was considered a OSH towing cam by performance standards. But here's what that mild cam gave him: cylinder pressure at low RPM for launching, enough overlap for good scavenging and cooling, and a power band that started at 1,500 RPM and pulled to 5,500. He didn't need to rev to 7,000 because he wasn't trying to make peak power. He was trying to make usable, repeatable power. The engine would pull from 2,000 RPM in high gear, crucial for those times when he short-shifted to keep temperatures down. The exhaust system followed the same philosophy: no headers. Danny ran stock cast iron manifolds into a 2.5S dual exhaust with turbo mufflers. The cast iron manifolds were another heat sink, helping to stabilize underhood temperatures. They also provided excellent low-end torque, crucial for 60-foot times. The 2.5er pipes were considered too small by magazine standards, but they maintained exhaust velocity, which improved scavenging. Total cost for the exhaust, including mufflers and tailpipes, $180 at the local muffler shop. And the cooling system was where Danny's approach really paid dividends. He kept the stock 4-core radiator, but added a $15 flex fan from the junkyard and wired in a manual override switch for the electric fan from a late-model Camaro. The key innovation was his coolant mixture. Instead of running straight water with water wetter like the race guys, or 50-50 antifreeze like the street guys, Danny ran a 70-30 water-to-antifreeze mix with a bottle of Red Line water wetter. This gave him the heat transfer properties of mostly water, enough antifreeze for corrosion protection and slight boiling point elevation, and the surface tension reduction from the additive. His cooling system was pressurized to 16 psi using a cap from a diesel truck, raising the boiling point to about 250 degrees. But the real cooling secret was operational, not mechanical. Danny would start his cool-down procedure immediately after crossing the finish line. He'd throw it in neutral, coast to a safe speed, then restart the engine, and idle back to the pits with both fans running. By the time he got to the staging lanes for the next round, his engine temperature was back to 180 degrees. The guys running without fans, or worse, shutting their engines off hot, were starting each round with heat-soaked engines. He learned the transmission was a TH350 that Danny rebuilt himself using a $150 rebuild kit and a $40 shift kit. He modified the governor weights to get firmer 1-2 and 2-3 shifts at part throttle, crucial for consistency. The torque converter was a stock 2200 RPM stall unit, again considered too tight for performance use. But it allowed Danny to leave the line at lower RPM, generating less heat and stress while still providing enough multiplication for good 60-foot times. And on the differential was a 12-bolt with 3.73 gears and a clutch-type limited slip. Nothing exotic, just reliable. Danny shimmed the clutch packs for more preload, giving him better traction without the violent engagement of a spool or locker. He ran the same 235/60 R15 BF Goodrich radial TAs that came on the car. No slicks, no drag radials. Street tires that he could drive to the track on. Here's where the story gets interesting. The first time Danny showed up at Riverside's Wednesday night bracket racing, nobody took him seriously. The car was primer gray with oxidized aluminum wheels. The engine didn't lope. It didn't have that violent, barely controlled idle that screamed race car. Dop. It sounded like a mildly warmed-over street engine, which is exactly what it was. His first opponent was a yellow '70 Chevelle with a tunnel ram 454. The Chevelle owner was literally laughing as they staged. The tree dropped, and Danny's Nova launched with zero wheel spin, shifting at exactly 5,200 RPM. The Chevelle hazed the tires, recovered, then missed third gear because the driver was shifting too aggressively. Danny won by 3 car lengths, running a 13.47 at 101 mph. The Chevelle ran 13.52 at 108 mph, faster trap speed but slower elapsed time. Then that night, Danny won 5 rounds before losing in the finals to a well-sorted Fox body Mustang. But here's the key. His times were consistent. 13.47, 13.45, 13.48, 13.46, 13.44, 13.49. 6 runs, all within 0.05 of each other. The temperature gauge never moved past 185 degrees. The oil pressure stayed at 45 psi. The engine never missed a beat. None or N-word started to spread. The next week, more people were paying attention. Danny won that event outright, taking home $500 and a trophy. His competitor in the finals was driving a beautiful blue '69 Camaro with a 383 stroker that had been featured in Hot Rod magazine. The Camaro had run 1290s in earlier rounds but was down to 1320s by the finals, heat-soaked and detonating. Danny ran his typical 13.45 and won on a hole shot. The beauty of Danny's approach became more apparent as the summer wore on. While other racers were constantly wrenching, changing jets, pulling timing, adding octane booster, Danny just drove. He'd check the oil, check the tire pressure, and go racing. His maintenance routine between events consisted of changing the oil and filter. That's it. No valve adjustments, no plug changes, no carburetor rebuilds. The engine was so under stress that nothing wore out. And then by August, Danny had won 6 of the 12 Wednesday night events he'd entered. His total prize money exceeded $3,000. More importantly, he'd spent less than $100 on maintenance and repairs. Compare that to the guy with the Chevelle who'd already been through 2 transmissions and a set of head gaskets, or the Camaro owner who'd windowed the block and was building a new engine. The local speed shop started taking notice. They offered Danny sponsorship deals, free parts, anything to get their sticker on his car. He turned them all down. He didn't want to compromise his philosophy for marketing. The whole point was that you didn't need expensive parts to go fast. You needed to understand the problem you were solving. And in Danny's notebook from that summer is a master class in practical engineering. Every run was documented. Ambient temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, density altitude, 60-foot time, 1/8 mile, 1/4 mile, trap speed, engine temperature at the finish line, oil pressure, and even the wait time between rounds. He could predict his ET within 0.02 based on weather conditions. He knew that for every 100 feet of density altitude increase, he'd lose about 0.015 seconds. He knew that his car ran best between 7 and 9 p.m. when the track temperature was dropping, but the air was still relatively dry. The thermal vacuum switch modification evolved over the summer. Danny added a manual override that let him activate the cold air system during staging if the engine was already hot. He experimented with different snorkel locations, eventually settling on a spot just behind the left headlight where air pressure was highest at speed. He even fabricated a simple ram air effect using aluminum flashing that gained him another degree or two of temperature drop. One of the most impressive aspects of Danny's system was how it performed in varying conditions. During a particularly brutal heat wave in September, when track temperatures exceeded 140 degrees and multiple cars were overheating just idling in the staging lanes, Danny's Nova ran within a tenth of its normal times. The combination of heat management strategies, the thermal mass of cast iron, the cold air induction, the optimized cooling system, and the conservative tune made the car nearly weatherproof. The psychology of racing played into Danny's success too. His competitors would see this primer gray Nova pull into the staging lanes and immediately underestimate it. They'd overdrive, miss shifts, or red light trying to cut a better light against what they assumed was an easy win. Danny's reaction times were consistent 550s, not great, but good enough when combined with consistent ETs. He won more races on his opponent's mistakes than on pure performance. There was one particular night in October that perfectly encapsulated Danny's advantage. It was an unusually hot evening, still 92 degrees at 8 p.m. The track had been prepping for a big money race that weekend, so they'd been spraying it with VHT traction compound all day. The surface was incredibly sticky, but also held heat like crazy. Cars were spinning on the starting line because the tires were literally melting to the track. Danny watched 3 cars ahead of him either spin violently or bog on launch. He made a quick adjustment. He dropped his launch RPM from 1800 to 1500 and short-shifted first gear at 4500 instead of 5200. The Nova left soft, hooked perfectly, and ran its quickest pass of the year, 1341 at 101 mph. His opponent, running slicks that were getting gummy from the heat, spun all the way through first gear and lost by half a track. And the technical data Danny collected was invaluable. He discovered that his engine made peak torque at 3,400 RPM and held it flat until 4,200 RPM, exactly where he needed it for launching and driving through the gears. The horsepower peaked at a modest 5,400 RPM, but it was a fat, flat curve that started building at 2,500 RPM. Calculated out, the engine was making about 285 horsepower and 340 lb-ft of torque. Not impressive by magazine standards, but it made that power reliably, repeatedly, in any weather condition. And Danny's fuel economy data was equally interesting. The car averaged 18 mpg on the street and used about 2 gallons during a typical race night, including all the idling and staging. Compare that to the big block cars that were getting 6 mpg and burning 5 to 10 gallons per event. Over a summer of racing, Danny spent about $150 on gas. The fuel cost alone for some competitors exceeded Danny's entire build budget. The durability of Danny's approach was proven when he decided to tear down the engine that winter for inspection. After a full season of racing, probably 200 quarter-mile passes plus street driving, the bearings still showed the factory markings. The cylinder walls had no measurable wear. The valve springs had lost less than 5 pounds of seat pressure. The only parts he replaced were the valve seals, more as preventative maintenance than necessity. Total rebuild cost, $87. The influence of Danny's success rippled through the Riverside racing community. By the next season, multiple racers had adopted elements of his approach. Cold air induction became standard. People started running smaller carburetors. The obsession with giant cams diminished. Most importantly, racers began thinking about consistency and durability rather than just peak power. There's a fascinating postscript to this story. Danny went on to study mechanical engineering at Cal Poly. His senior project was a detailed analysis of intake air temperature effects on volumetric efficiency in naturally aspirated engines. The paper included data from his racing experience and proved mathematically what he discovered practically, that a 100-degree reduction in intake air temperature could be worth as much as 40 horsepower in real-world conditions. And Danny's professor, a former GM engineer, was so impressed that he forwarded the paper to contacts at Chevrolet's performance division. This led to Danny being offered a job at GM Performance Parts after graduation, where he worked on what would become the LS series of engines. The LS engine's emphasis on efficient airflow, conservative cam timing, and excellent heat management can trace some DNA back to Danny's primer gray Nova.ADN. The $40 Cadillac Thermax system became something of a legend in California bench racing circles. Guys would spend hours at swap meets looking for similar setups. The irony was that most of them missed the point. They'd install the system, but then run massive cams that negated the benefits, or they'd combine it with other modifications that introduced new problems. They were copying the solution without understanding the problem. And what made Danny's approach so effective wasn't any single modification. It was the system's thinking. Every change supported every other change. The mild cam worked with the small carburetor to provide crisp throttle response. The cast iron components provided thermal stability that let the conservative tune stay consistent. The cold air induction preserved power that the cooling system helped maintain. The stock converter and gears were perfectly matched to the engine's power band. Remove any one element, and the whole system became less effective. The financial impact was equally systematic. Danny proved that a $2,000 total investment could consistently beat $20,000 builds, but more than that, he showed that the ongoing costs were minimal. No broken parts, no expensive race gas, no constant tuning and adjustment. His cost per run was essentially just the entry fee and 2 gallons of regular unleaded. Some guys were spending more on octane booster per night than Danny spent on his entire induction system. And the philosophical implications went deeper. Danny challenged the fundamental assumptions of hot rodding culture. The idea that bigger was better, that more compression meant more power, that you needed expensive parts to go fast. He dismantled all of it with empirical evidence. His success suggested that maybe the aftermarket performance industry was selling solutions to problems that didn't need to exist. And there's a thermodynamics principle called entropy that states systems naturally move toward disorder. In racing terms, this means heat buildup, component wear, and decreasing performance over time. Danny's approach was essentially anti-entropic. By starting with lower stress levels and better heat management, he slowed the rate of degradation to nearly zero. While other engines were falling apart after 50 passes, his was running like new after 200. The testing methodology Danny developed was ahead of its time. Today we have sophisticated data logging systems that record hundreds of parameters, thousands of times per second. Danny was achieving similar insights with a notebook, a stopwatch, and careful observation. He understood that data without context was meaningless, but patterns revealed truth. His notes about density-altitude effects predated widespread understanding of this phenomenon in bracket racing by several years. The relationship between air density and engine performance is now well understood, but in 1987, most racers attributed day-to-day variations to everything except atmospheric conditions. Danny's recognition that a 2,000-foot increase in density altitude was worth 0.2 in the quarter mile gave him a huge advantage in bracket racing, where consistency was everything. He could adjust his dial-in based on weather conditions while his competitors were guessing, And modern engine management systems do automatically what Danny did mechanically. Variable valve timing adjusts the cam profile for different RPM ranges. Electronic throttle control prevents bog on launch. Knock sensors pull timing when detonation is detected. But all these systems are solving problems that Danny avoided through design. His engine didn't need variable valve timing because the fixed timing was optimized for his usage. It didn't bog because the carburetor was properly sized. It didn't detonate because the intake air was cool and the tune was conservative. The legacy of Danny's approach extends beyond just drag racing. The same principles, system optimization, thermal management, and consistency over peak performance, apply to any form of motorsport. Endurance racers learned that finishing first required first finishing. Road racers discovered that managing tire and brake temperatures was as important as outright speed. Even in professional racing, the teams that won championships were often not the fastest, but the most consistent. In the modern era of 1,000-horsepower streetcars and 8-second door slammers, Danny's 13-second Nova seems quaint. But adjusted for inflation, his $2,000 investment would be about $5,000 today. Try building anything that runs 1340s consistently for $5,000 now. The cheapest crate engine that would do it costs more than that alone. Add in the transmission, differential, cooling system, and fuel system to support it, and you're looking at $15,000 minimum.en. The real lesson from Danny Chen's story isn't about the specific modifications he made. It's about the approach to problem solving. He identified what actually mattered: consistency and durability in extreme heat. He understood the physics involved: air density, thermal dynamics, and volumetric efficiency. He tested systematically and documented everything. He optimized the entire system rather than individual components. And he proved that intelligence and methodology could overcome brute force and big budgets. And today, Danny Chen is a senior engineer at a major automotive manufacturer working on next-generation engine technologies. He still has the Nova, now painted properly and sitting in his garage. It still runs 1340s 35 years later. The original $40 Thermax system is still installed, still working. He occasionally takes it to nostalgia drag races, where it continues to surprise people who expect old technology to be slow. And when asked about his racing philosophy, Danny says something that should be carved in stone at every drag strip in America. Your speed costs money. Consistency costs thought. Most racers would rather spend than think. That's why I kept winning with a $40 solution to a problem everyone else was throwing thousands at. They were trying to overcome physics with horsepower. I was working with physics to preserve the horsepower I had. The California teenager who outsmarted Chevy with a junkyard air cleaner didn't just win races. He proved that, in engineering, like in life, understanding the problem is more valuable than having the most expensive solution. That primer gray Nova became a rolling laboratory that validated principles now used in everything from Formula One to diesel trucks. Not bad for a high school kid with $40 and a different way of thinking. And what's your take on Danny's approach? Have you ever seen someone dominate with unexpected simplicity? Drop a comment below and share your own David versus Goliath racing stories. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into grassroots engineering genius, hit that subscribe button for more stories of innovative underdogs who changed the game. Until next time, remember, it's not about how much you spend, it's about how much you understand.